Content warning, this episode makes reference to suicide and attempted suicide. What happens when a citizen moves legally to a country and half a century later their status to live in that country they call home is revoked? What happens when the state tells you to leave because it failed to record your entry correctly in the first place? What happens when a country seemingly erases the contribution of an entire generation to meet immigration targets? It results in scandal, in a continuing fight for justice, and now in commemoration. Hello, welcome to Spare a Thought, the podcast for curious minds, exploring creativity, culture, and stories from the margins. I'm your host, Tom Spare, and today we're talking about Windrush Day. To commemorate and celebrate Windrush Day, you'll hear from four other contributors today. Chiari Page, a fellow member of the Be The Change Media Network, talking about an episode called Borders of Belonging for her podcast Shadow and Light, all about the Windrush scandal. Following Chiari, you'll hear from Dr. Nick Beach, a trustee for the Stuart Hall Foundation and a lead on the Stuart Hall Archive project. Nick will be introducing the work of Professor Stuart Hall, who came to the UK from Jamaica in the early 1950s and was one of the originators of the Birmingham School and creator of cultural studies, with contributions also from Professor Les Back at the University of Glasgow, both of whom will be speaking on Stuart's legacy and the man himself. But before we go any further, I want to introduce my fellow co-presenter today, Leo. Leo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello, I'm Leo. So I grew up in Newport, and in my free time, I do some volunteering stuff with guides and I like to read books. I studied psychology and sociology A-levels, and I'm going to be going into journalism at Portsmouth in September.
Amazing. So, Leo, I've brought you in to help me with the research, produce and review the episodes that we put out into the world. So thanks for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
That's okay.
So for this episode, Leo has researched about Windrush Day. Leo, do you want to give listeners an overview? Like, what is Windrush Day?
Yeah, of course. So Windrush Day, which takes place annually on the 22nd of June, is a national day of commemoration in the United Kingdom that honours the contribution of the Windrush generation and their descendants to British society. So the Windrush generation refers to people who migrated to the UK from the Caribbean countries and other Commonwealth nations in the years following the Second World War.
Nice, thank you. And what does the day itself actually commemorate?
It commemorates the arrival of the ship HMT Empire Windrush at Tilbury Docks in Essex in 1948, which brought 1,027 Caribbean passengers to Britain. Their arrival has become a symbol of post-war migration and the development of modern multicultural Britain.
So although the first wave came in 1948, it took 70 years to create Windrush Day.
That's right. The first commemoration started in 2018, marked by community events, exhibitions, educational activities, performances, and the celebration of Caribbean heritage and culture. Tom, who were the Windrush generation?
The Windrush generation were people who came to the United Kingdom from the Caribbean countries, as described, and other parts of the Commonwealth between 1948 and the early 1970s to help fill labour shortages after the Second World War. So they were invited by the UK government, and many of them found work in sectors that were crucial to rebuilding the country, so public transport, manufacturing, construction, and many went to the newly established National Health Service, the NHS.
And at the time, many Caribbean islands were part of the British Empire, so under the British Nationality Act 1948, they had the legal right to live and work in Britain.
So which countries did they come from in the Caribbean? There's quite a long list, actually. So Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Montserrat. Then the Immigration Act of 1971 came into effect, restricting the automatic rights of Commonwealth citizens to settle in the UK.
This is generally regarded as the end of the Windrush generation period, as people couldn't migrate as freely.
So, Leo, in your research, why did the British government actively recruit people from the Caribbean to come to the UK?
So, what I found was that there were two main reasons. The first was post-war labour shortages. After 1945, Britain had a damaged economy and infrastructure from the war, as well as a declining workforce. So, many men had been killed or injured, and a lot of women had stopped working after the war, alongside the rapid expansion of public services, especially in the newly created NHS. Industries like transport, railways, manufacturing, and construction also needed workers that Britain simply didn't have anymore.
And what was the second reason?
Caribbean countries were members of the Empire. They had citizenship rights under the British Nationality Act of 1948 to live and work in the UK. The government didn't always run large formal recruitment drives at first, but they did really actively encourage migration, allowed and later supported the travel from the Caribbean, and didn't restrict entry in early years.
Having the Windrush generation enter the UK helped the economic rebuilding. Migrants from the Caribbean were seen as a solution to fill unskilled and semi-skilled jobs that were hard to staff, keep public services running, and support Britain's post-war economic recovery and modernisation. Leo, do we know how many people came over as part of the Windrush generation?
Roughly around 500,000 people from the Caribbean relocated to the UK during the Windrush era. However, the exact figure is really hard to pin down because migration was gradual and records were not always consistent or centralised, and this links to the wider scandal.
So that's right. So the change to the rights of the Windrush generation after they'd arrived came with the Immigration Act of 1971, which ended automatic Commonwealth rights and introduced tighter immigration control based on the right of abode and formal documentation.
Although those already in the UK were meant to be protected, many Windrush migrants were never given the paperwork to prove this status.
Later enforcement policies, especially the hostile environment measures from 2012 under Home Secretary Theresa May, made legal status much stricter across jobs, housing, banks, and healthcare.
The consequences were really serious. Some Windrush people were wrongly denied NHS treatment, benefits, and employment. Others lost their jobs and homes, and some were detained and threatened with deportation despite having lived in the UK legally for decades. The impact went beyond practical losses. It caused severe stress, fear, and family separation, and in some cases, people died before their status was resolved or compensation was received.
Two examples really bring that home. So Dexter Bristol was a 58-year-old man who'd lived in the UK since the age of 8. He lost his cleaning job and his benefits because he lacked a passport, suffered severe depression, and died while trying to prove his legal status.
And Richard Black, a Windrush child who arrived in the UK in 1960 and was stranded outside of the country for decades after an expired passport caused the Home Office to deny his return. He was separated from his life and unable to see his dying mother, and even attempted suicide twice, showing the devastating effects of the Windrush scandal created.
It's very important to sort of fix on that, really, because this is the issue with changes to immigration status. It's as much about, identity, about who you are. And a lot of these folks had grown up in the UK. They hadn't just sort of moved here a couple of years ago. They'd built entire lives. So as a result, Leo, what's the current state of the Windrush compensation scheme, and has justice actually been delivered?
The Windrush compensation scheme was set up in 2019 to pay for people who had suffered losses after being wrongly classed as having no legal right to live in the UK during the scandal. While compensation has been paid out, progress has been slow, with long delays and complex evidence requirements, and some eligible people dying before receiving payment.
And as a result, only a fraction of expected claims have been fully resolved. So although the government has made adjustments and issued apologies, many critics and affected communities argue that full justice hasn't yet been delivered. The scheme hasn't fully compensated all those harmed or addressed the wider impact of the scandal. It's a major letdown and has had wide ramifications. So that's the scandal in broad strokes, but there's a lot more to unpack. Fellow podcaster Chiari Page has gone deeper into the scandal on her podcast Shadow and Light in an episode called Borders of Belonging. So here's Chiari.
Hi, my name is Kiari Page, and I am the creator and host of Shadow and Light, a storytelling podcast that explores the systems, histories, and human experiences that shape our world. Each episode combines spoken word, original music, sound design, and historical research to examine topics such as identity, belonging, power, survival, and equality. What makes Shadow and Light different is that it just doesn't focus on historical events. It explores how these events continue to influence our lives today. Through the Be a Change Media Network, the podcast creates space for curiosity, reflection, and conversations that challenge us to look beyond what we know. Like many people, I knew the broad outline of the story. I knew that people from the Caribbean had been invited to Britain after the Second World War to help rebuild the country and fill labor shortages. I also knew about the Windrush scandal and that many people who had every right to be in the UK later faced challenges proving their status. But I realized there was a difference between knowing the facts and understanding the lived experience. The deeper I went into research, the more I understood that this wasn't just a story about immigration. It was a story about identity, contribution, belonging, and what happens when people help build a country are later asked to prove that they belong. What surprised me most was the emotional impact of documentation and paperwork. When we think about identity, we often think about culture, family, community, or personal experiences. But for many people affected by the Windrush scandal, their entire sense of security became tied to these documents they never were told they need. I was struck by how something as simple as missing paperwork could affect access to work, housing, healthcare, and even a person's sense of dignity. And it reminded me of my experience as being a migrant in this country. And it also made me reflect on how systems can sometimes value documentation over lived reality. I think many people still see the Windrush generation only through the lens of the scandal. While the scandal is important, it must be remembered. It shouldn't overshadow the extraordinary contribution that the Windrush generation made to British society. These were people who helped rebuild post-war Britain. They worked in the NHS, public transport, education, manufacturing, and countless other sectors. Their influence can be seen in British culture, music, food, sport, and even community life. Their legacy isn't just about what happened to them, it's about what they built. Windrush Day is important because remembrance is about more than looking backwards. It gives us the opportunity to recognize the contributions of a generation that helped shape modern Britain, while also reflecting on the lessons their experiences can teach us today. For me, Windrush Day is about honoring resilience, recognizing contribution, and understanding that belonging should never be measured by paperwork. It's also a reminder that history isn't something separate from the present. The stories we chose to remember shape how we understand identity, citizenship, community, and each other. And ultimately, that's what Borders of Belonging is about, asking who gets to belong, who gets to be remembered, and what happens when humanity is reduced to a file.
So we've given an overview of what Windrush Day is all about, who the Windrush generation are, and we've also heard from Kiari about her episode Borders of Belonging. Let's take a look at some of the famous names, notable artists, musicians, academics, and public figures with links to the Windrush generation.
The first person I'd like to talk about is Andrea Levy. Levy was a major British novelist whose parents came from Jamaica during the Windrush period. Her most famous novel, Small Island, explores the experiences of Caribbean migrants in post-war Britain, racism, housing struggles, and cultural adjustments.
Levy's work is especially important because it brings Windrush history into mainstream British literature in a really personal, human way. She helped readers understand the emotional and social reality behind migration, not just the historical facts.
Next up is Linton Kwesi Johnson, a pioneering dub poet who arrived in Britain from Jamaica as a child. He became famous in the 1970s and 80s for poetry, performed over reggae rhymes, often written in Jamaican patois.
His work addressed racism, police violence, and Black British identity, making him both an artist and a political voice for the Windrush generation and their descendants. Poems like England is a Bitch became powerful expressions of migrant struggle and resistance in Britain.
Valerie Amos was born in Guyana and moved to the UK as a child during the Windrush era. She became one of the most significant Black British public figures in government and international politics.
Amos made history as the first Black woman to serve as a UK cabinet minister and later held senior roles at the United Nations, including Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. Her career represents the long-term political and institutional impact of Windrush migration and the rise of Caribbean-descended leadership in Britain.
Next is Pat McGrath, one of the most influential makeup artists in the world, born in Britain to a Jamaican mother who arrived during the Windrush era.
McGrath revolutionized the global beauty industry by making makeup more inclusive for dark skin tones and launched her own hugely successful cosmetics brand. Her work has reshaped fashion and beauty standards worldwide, showing how Windrush era migration has influenced even global creative industries far beyond Britain.
Next is Sir Steve McQueen, a director, screenwriter, and artist born in London to a Grenadian mother and a Trinidadian father. He's best known for his films Hunger and 12 Years a Slave, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture, making him the first black filmmaker to do so.
Across his career, McQueen has received numerous awards for both his art and his film work. In 1999, he won the Turner Prize for his original approach to film installation, and he's also worked as an official war artist representing Britain at the Venice Biennale in 2009.
In 2014, Time magazine named him one of the most influential people in the world, and in 2016 he received the British Film Institute's highest honour, the BFI Fellowship. He was knighted in 2020 New Year honours for service to film. It's worth noting that members of the Windrush generation and the following generation contributed in many arenas. In sports, for instance, footballer John Barnes and Marcus Rashford, athletes like Dame Jessica Ennis-Hill, and musicians like Olivia Dean, whose grandmother moved from the Caribbean to London.
That's a really good summary of the different people that have contributed that have links to the Caribbean. A person who best encapsulates the diaspora experience was Professor Stuart Hall. Hall was one of the most influential thinkers in modern British academia and a founding figure of cultural studies. He was born in Jamaica and came to Britain in the 1950s, studying at Oxford University as part of the wider Windrush era migration. His work focused on identity, race, media, and how culture shapes society, especially in post-colonial Britain.
Hall helped explain how migration and racism shaped Britishness itself, arguing that identity is always changing rather than fixed. He became a key intellectual voice for understanding multicultural Britain and influenced generations of sociologists, historians, and political thinkers. I even studied him at A-level sociology.
To close out today's episode, we wanted to introduce our two final contributors, Dr. Nick Beach and Professor Les Back. So Dr. Nick Beach from the University of Birmingham, who is a trustee of the Stuart Hall Foundation and leads on the university's Stuart Hall archive, worked with Professor Hall at the end of his life, helping with transcriptions of Hall's papers, and Professor Les Back, an academic at the University of Glasgow, who knew Hall, interviewed him, and whose work on sociology, race, and immigration saw lots of overlap. So first you'll hear from Nick and then Les.
Yes, I worked for Stuart Hall for about 3 years, from 2011 until his death in 2014. I was commissioned by Catherine Hall to work for Stuart as a transcriber. So initially to transcribe his handwritten notes and typescripts onto a computer, and then subsequently, as the months went on, to transcribe directly from his voice. Most of that work became what's now known as Familiar Stranger, A Life Between Two Islands, which was heavily worked on by Bill Schwartz and is available from Penguin Books. And that's really Stuart's reflections, memories, account of his formation in Jamaica in the 1930s and his arrival in Britain in 1951. What did I learn from working closely with him over 2.5 years? I was visiting him every week for 4 hours, so I learned many things. But I think the important thing that I'd share with everyone is the generosity which he showed towards others. Young people who were contacting him for the first time, through to old colleagues and comrades from the very distant past. He shared his time when he was tired, when he was ill. He shared his thoughts, and he responded even to criticisms that people continue to make about certain elements of his work in the past and in the present. I think he modeled, for me anyway, he modeled an exemplary form of socialism. Other people mattered, and winning an argument mattered to him. Stuart Hall Foundation, that was launched in 2015 by Hall's family, friends, and former colleagues, so quite soon after his death. It's really an attempt to extend Hall's work into the present, building on his understanding of intellectual life. For Hall, the intellectual life doesn't really happen just in those institutions that are labelled as intellectual or knowledge-making institutions like schools and universities, those organisations that are designated as for preserving and generating new knowledge. For Hall, intellectual life goes on in all kinds of places, through all kinds of media, all the time, that everybody really is some kind of intellectual. And so that's one side of the Foundation's work, to support intellectual activity that might not be recognised as such and might not otherwise go on. On the other side are Hall's political commitments to address pressing, often fraught political, social and cultural questions in our present moment and generate emancipatory ways through those questions. As the Foundation has it on its website, quote, "We are committed to equipping a wider public with the intellectual tools to intervene in national and international debates on race and class by facilitating a combination of artistic and intellectual interventions." So that's achieved through three main strands of work. One is quite a large number of collaborations with a wide range of institutional partners, supporting scholarships, fellowships, residencies, and commissions, and providing opportunities for underrepresented practitioners in particular. Secondly, to provide free-to-access digital learning resources, drawing on a body of interdisciplinary approaches to social and cultural issues. And finally, the production of a program of digital and physical forums for the public at which new interdisciplinary work is shared. So that's really the sort of set of purposes of the Foundation and three of the main ways in which it meets those purposes. I mean, I think in some ways, I and many of his former colleagues feel that Stuart Hall is both everywhere and nowhere. I think on the one hand, many of Stuart Hall's main arguments, or certain aspects of his main arguments, have really become a sort of common sense. When Stuart Hall first started working on media and culture, with people like Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams, it was widely understood that there were sort of two forms of culture, or really just one form of culture, and that was literature, poetry, the fine arts, that which had been designated cultural, usually protected and preserved and conserved in major institutions, the Oxbridge colleges, the museums, the institutes, and possibly even an institution like the BBC, who would make decisions about what was worthy of the title of culture and what was not. Everything else, adverts, cheap movies, TV, radio, commercial radio in particular, pulp fictions, comic books, the stuff of the sort of ephemeral stuff of everyday life, that was not culture. That was some sort of like mass culture, maybe, but it wasn't really properly culture. It was the work of Stuart Hall and others like him to argue that no, all elements of our life where we're communicating every day can be considered cultural and have meaning and have value. And really we have to understand how people use these very different cultural forms to make sense of their lives, make sense of each other, make sense of their world. I don't think you'll find anyone today who would argue against that. It's quite rare to find somebody who still holds an elitist view of culture. Pretty much everybody has investments in an appreciation of what would in the past have been considered quite trashy TV or trashy movies or whatever. It's quite acceptable now to have a broad range and a broad understanding of culture. On the other hand, I don't think it's really well understood just how Stuart Hall really was thinking through culture as the ground for politics. And although the radical right seems to have been promoting an idea that politics is downstream of culture and that the culture wars have become primary in some senses, I don't think that is how Stuart Hall understood the relationship between politics and culture either. So in many ways, I think his actual work and his actual understanding of media, of politics, of culture, many people still have not come to terms with that at all, actually. And there's still a lot of work to be done there.
Now, that's Nick's connection to Stuart, the role of the Stuart Hall Foundation, and why his work remains relevant today. When I spoke to Nick last year, he mentioned an essay that Stuart Hall published on the 1st of December 1999 called Unsettling, the Heritage, Reimagining the Post-Nation, Whose Heritage? In it, he argues that Britain's national story had largely left people like the Windrush generation out of it, out of museums, out of the curriculum, out of the heritage we're taught. Here's Nick talking about that very essay.
I still impressed by Whose Heritage as a compressed statement on how our understanding of ourselves in the past and what is valuable about our past and therefore our heritage and what we've inherited, how Stuart Hall has managed to compress it into a short essay, an extraordinary range of knowledge and understanding about that. On the one hand, he demonstrates how heritage is produced, that it's manufactured and produced, and that there are major power institutions that promote certain forms of heritage of the past. On the other hand, he explores all the techniques and technologies, practices, means by which heritage is reproduced in those institutions. So he makes an argument for understanding how our museums, our art galleries, our media institutions, how they manage, curate, preserve, conserve, disseminate, and give access to or deny access to the past and our heritage. Then he goes on to discuss just how many people are excluded from the conception of heritage, particularly in England and Britain more broadly. Just how many people are excluded from the heritage, as he calls it. This includes particularly migrant and diaspora communities in Britain. And he talks about why that exclusion is made, and then goes on to make the claim or the demand that diasporic and migrant people have greater access to our institutions, that they are trained in the techniques and technologies and practices of heritage reproduction, and that transformations are made, therefore, to the collections, how they're curated, how they're preserved, and how they're disseminated. And probably the most exciting part of the essay is his conclusion, where he argues, and all of that transformation and all of that change and all of that greater access and all of that change to those collections will not be enough. That actually, deep down inside the English heritage tradition, not English heritage, the institution, but the English heritage industry overall, deep down inside that industry of heritage is a commitment to conservation and preservation and a fixing of the past. And that those who are, in some senses, doubly diasporic, so those particularly, he's thinking of his own formation, that is somebody whose heritage goes from Africa through the Middle Passage and enslavement to the Caribbean and the plantation system, and then from the Caribbean to the metropole, to Britain. He thinks of that double journey as one that means that there is, because of the erasures that occur through that process, the cultural erasures, the destruction that occurs deliberately through those passages. Because of that, there's no way in which the heritage can be recovered through the curation of fixed, isolated objects of the past. That actually the only way in which it could be kept alive, that history could be kept alive, is by a constant remaking and a refashioning. So he actually turns to, in particular forms of popular music. So he turns to hip hop, rap, any music that samples and reconstructs elements of the past for the present. And he calls that a form of heritage making. And I think that's quite a strong intervention in our conception of heritage, a powerful one and an important one. So as a whole, as an essay, I think it makes a really important intervention into heritage debates, which still resonate today.
Hello, my name's Les Back. I teach sociology at the University of Glasgow, but I suppose my formation was in the early 1980s. And I've written a lot about both racism in the media and in popular culture, but also I've written a lot about the role of the media, I suppose, and how to understand it. So, Stuart Hall, he wrote a book about youth culture with a bunch of other postgraduate students called Resistance Through Rituals, which I remember reading. And she was telling the whole story of British society through style, through music. He was not born in the UK. He wasn't of England or London, but he was the best student of Englishness and British culture, I think, of his generation. And he would say, take the cup of tea, the quintessential icon of Englishness. Where does the tea come from? Where does the sugar come from? It doesn't come from Croydon or Essex, so in that thing, and I met Stuart and had a conversation with him that was recorded many, many years later. And we sat and talked for hours and hours and hours over cereal pots of tea with a woolen tea cozy. He could tell the story of empire through the cup of tea, the plantation societies of the Caribbean, as well as the plantations of the Indian subcontinent. That small material object of small pleasure was linked to this larger historical story of the relationship between Britain and the world.
So that was Dr. Nick Beach and Professor Les Back. Before we close out today, Leo, do you have any final reflections?
Yeah, I mean, I was so surprised that it took till 2018 and after the scandal for there to be some commemoration to this. I think that's a real shame. That's awful. And I think this is only looking at a small piece of what's happened to people because of this scandal. But I mean, people did try to take their own lives, and it's awful.
I was feeling the same way about the commemorations only starting in 2018. And obviously it was a good opportunity to sort of record that because it was 70 years later. And obviously a lot of the older members of the community were getting quite elderly. But yeah, I was really shocked about that it took so long to commemorate. And am I right in thinking you didn't really cover it at school? Is that right?
No, we didn't. So when researching this, when you asked me to research this, Tom, I was really excited because I've heard sort of the word Windrush thrown about, and I was like, I've always heard it, but I don't actually know what it is. And then as I started to research it, I was really surprised that it never got brought up in school because I was, I think, maybe in year 6 when the scandal came about, and I still never heard about it.
Yeah. And I hope that it's taught more in schools now. Like when I was at school, it was never even, discussed. I'm a fair bit older than you. So it's the history was sort of taught quite differently. And it was very much about the British Empire or I don't even know if it was explicitly about the British Empire, but there was stuff about the Tudors and World War One, but not really about how the country's made. And I think modern Britain, we owe so much to immigrants. If you think about the people that worked to help rebuild the country, but also culturally, like music, film, literature, it made our country so much richer. You think about Sir Steve McQueen or Zadie Smith or Olivia Dean. These are folks that really express their cultural identity and their past, and they honor their heritage as well, which is really important. So it sort of serves as a way through music, through film, through TV, through books, as a way of sort of capturing. I've started reading Stuart Hall's book. I think it's one of his last books that he published, which is sort of like an autobiography between two islands. And he talks about there being a sort of double diaspora, basically, that his identity being from Jamaica is both of being his heritage being from Africa and then his heritage being from Jamaica, before then moving and spending the majority of his life, sort of like nearly 70 years, or 60 odd years in Britain. So he was, as the clip that we played with Les Back, very much aware of British life, of Englishness, and was very much able to be a commentator on the way in which British society worked. So thanks for listening today. You've been listening to Spare a Thought for Windrush Day.
Our thanks to Key, Dr. Nick Beach and Professor Les Back for your contributions today.
And also I'd like to give it up for my fellow co-host and researcher for this episode, Leo. Thank you very much, Leo.
You're welcome. It's been really interesting learning more about the Windrush generation.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, there are plenty of links in the show notes to explore more of today's topics. And if you're in Cardiff on the 16th of July, you can come and watch a live recording of the show in Catay's Community Centre, 6 till 8 p.m. The event is free and will include topics like media literacy, ethical storytelling, and the foundations of creating podcasts and blogs, along with the recording of the podcast itself. And the guest is Harriet White, who is a breathing coach. So I'm looking forward to hosting, and hopefully I'll be able to see you there.
Please rate, review, subscribe, and share. Your support amplifies the show to reach new audiences.
This episode was co-hosted and researched by Leonora Cartman.
And edited and co-hosted by Tom Spare. Spare a Thought is a Be the Change Media Network production.
I'm Tom Spare.
I'm Leonora Cartman.
Thanks for listening.
Whether you like them or not, young shall grow. Better fill them with love. Then them go know. In this life you don't give up. Even when you know, if you fall, get back up. Young shall